To talk about the mind, I really have to kind of explain my three-agent model of consciousness into the brain. So my claim is that there's actually good evidence that the way that the human brain is broken down is as shown by this picture here. In this picture here, there's three blocks. There's three internal blocks inside the human brain. They're labeled the experiencer, the thinker, and the doer. So I've taken this human agent, the human agent as a whole, and I've broken it down to three individual agents: the thinker, the doer, and the experiencer. Now, the evidence for the thinker and doer comes from dual process theory. I won't go into it in full detail, but dual process theory is a very well-established theory in psychology. They've done tons of experiments over the years that demonstrate that there are these two different systems for basically answering questions. Thinker agent will choose one answer. The doer agent will choose a different answer. And that's how they can demonstrate which agent is active in that student at that time. And the thinker agent is the one where you have to actually think about the problem and figure out something. The doer is kind of the intuitive answer that comes quickly. In dual process theory, they label these System 1 and System 2, very unimaginative names. I rename System 1 as doer and System 2 as thinker. And the doer is the fast intuitive answer. So the first answer that pops into your head, that usually comes from your doer. And if you don't check it out to see if that's the correct answer, that's the one that you might mark off on the test there and say that's the answer. If you think about it, you might realize, wait a second, the doer is not right there. I actually have a different answer that's the correct answer, and then the thinker gets involved, and that gives a different answer. So that's how they can demonstrate that these two different systems, the doer and the thinker. Basically, those are two different agents. There are two different agents that are trying to answer the same question, and they're competing in the brain to see who's going to produce the answer that we actually give out. And the doer actually makes the final decision, but the thinker has input into it, and it can decide. It can try to convince the doer that he's wrong, basically, is the way it works. So it takes an effort to convince the doer that he's wrong, and a lot of people are lazy and they just go with the quick answer that the doer provides rather than thinking about it and trying to come up with the right answer. The thinker and the doer both work in both the conceptual model of the world and the sensory model of the world. So in the diagram there, I show that the experiencer has two different models in it. It has the language or conceptual model, and it has the sensory model of the world. Both agents need both of those models of the world, and in fact, there isn't a clean distinction between sensory and language. There's a continuous hierarchy of concepts, basically, and categories, going from the raw sense data all the way up to the highest level concepts that we have. And so it's really one unified model of the world that has both conceptual information and sensory information. And both the thinker and doer work off of that model. So I created a third agent called the experiencer. My theory would be that the experiencer uses the back three lobes of the brain, because that's where all the sensory information comes in. The visual, auditory, tactile sensory information comes into there. And then the frontal lobe of the brain is where the motor area is. That's the part that controls the body. So that's the doer that's in the frontal lobes. The doer also has emotions. Those are in the frontal lobes also. And the executive function of the brain is what the thinker is, and that's mostly in the frontal lobes too. Now, there isn't a hard dividing line there between the doer and the experiencer there, but I think that's the major dividing line, is the frontal lobe. So what I believe mind is when we think that we're the thinker. So this experiencer here is where all the consciousness occurs. This is where the model of the world is constructed. And so our experience of the world comes from that model of the world that's inside the experiencer. The experiencer has the model of the world, so our consciousness, I believe, is contained completely within the experiencer. Our consciousness of the world, and that includes the sensory world out here, but it also the conceptual world. And the thing about creating a model of the world, what you're basically doing is you're understanding the world. You're understanding your sensory information coming in, you're interpreting that sensory information, fitting it with the model of the world that you have currently, and updating the model of the world with that sensory information. So that's what understanding is about. And the same occurs in conceptual world. When somebody says something to you, the concepts are coming in, and you have to fit those concepts into your current conceptual model of the world. And if they fit, then you understand it and you can incorporate it. If they don't fit, you think it's nonsense. For example, if they're talking in a foreign language that you don't understand, you can't incorporate that into the world because it doesn't make any sense to you. So understanding is part of what the experiencer does. And I would say that intuition, for example, comes from the experiencer. My definition of intuition is that intuition is understanding the way the world works without thinking. That's without the thinker. If you can understand the way the world works without thinking about it, that's intuition coming from the experiencer. On the other hand, there's instinct. Instinct is understanding what to do in the world without thinking. That comes from the doer. So the doer has instincts. So my thesis is that spirituality comes from trying to alleviate the suffering caused by the thinker. The thinker causes a lot of suffering in our life. When the thinker was first becoming the dominant agent, we would have noticed the thinker was causing that suffering, and both the theistic and non-theistic traditions came up with ways of ameliorating that suffering. The theistic traditions said that there is a God out there that creates the universe, and that we need to surrender our will and our life over the care of that God. So that's the thinker surrendering his control to the experiencer. And instead of the thinker being the dominant agent and the one that's running my life, I now turn it over to the experiencer and let the experiencer run my life. And I'll just be the helper on the side. But my main job is to turn over my will and control to the experiencer. Now, in the non-theistic spiritual traditions, they use things like meditation to get into the experiencer state, to get into the experiencing life as the experiencer rather than experiencing life as the thinker. If we're experiencing life as the thinker, that's what the normal modern human state is, completely identified with the thinker. In fact, I have some pictures here that talk about that. With this picture here, you have the three agents, and the model of the world is contained in the experiencer, but there are also self-models for each of the three agents. And the self-models of those three agents are also in the experiencer. That's part of the experiencer's model of the world. So the experiencer actually has four self-models in it. One is for the human as a whole. So the human as a whole is one agent, and it has a self-model of what that human thinks he is. And then you have the self-models of the three other agents, the thinker agent, the doer agent, and the experiencer agent. The self-model of the thinker agent is I, me, my. The self-model of the doer agent is the body. The self-model of the experiencer agent is the whole world. So those three don't change as you do spiritual practices. The thinker is always going to be I, me, my. The doer is always going to be the body. The experiencer is always going to be the whole world. However, the human agent as a whole, how does that agent get a self-model? Well, in the normal modern human, the thinker agent is shouting, we are, I, me, my. We are I, me, my. We, all these four agents that I'm talking about here, are I, me, my. I am the dominant agent. I am the one that's solving all the problems for you. You got to listen to me. I'm super important, and what I say, you should follow. So one of the things the thinker generates is the internal voice that we hear, the thought voice that we hear in our head. That's the experiencer hearing the thinker talk internally. So it's like hearing through your ears, but it's coming from the frontal lobes instead. So if the thinker achieves his goal of saying that we are I, me, my, the experiencer is going to make the human self-model equal the thinker self-model. So the human self-model will be I, me, my. And that's the state where we suffer, because that means that whatever the thinker says is the truth, and we got to believe it. And if the thinker thinks this is a bad situation, we got to do something about it as a human. That's the point when we're suffering the most in the normal modern human. A modern spiritual human has more like this model here. And in this model here, the human agent has still the thinker. I still think that I'm the I, me, my, but I'm also aware that I'm the body, and I'm also aware that I'm the experiencer. So the human self-model is now mostly the thinker, but there's a little bit of a doer in there, and there's a little bit of the experiencer in there. And the experiencer, for example, for theistic people could be their connection to God. So I've got this connection to God here inside of my self model. And the doer is the body, but the doer also has a lot of the spiritual virtues. I haven't talked about the spiritual virtues, but if you look at the list of spiritual virtues like love, acceptance, forgiveness, all those kinds of things, all of those things make a social life much better, right? You have a much easier social life if you can practice all the spiritual virtues. Whereas the spiritual vices are things like selfishness, self-centeredness, and resentment, and things like that. Those cause problems in relationships. The doer is the social agent. The doer has got the goals of evolution built into us of being a social animal. And so the doer has those spiritual virtues built in. So incorporating more of the doer into our self-model allows us to be more spiritual in those ways of practicing the spiritual virtues. If you think that you're totally the I, me, my, you're not going to be that interested in practicing the spiritual virtues, because that's not what the thinker is all about. The thinker is all about I, me, my. It's the ego. It's the self-centered, selfish person that's mostly practicing spiritual virtues of being resentful. The thinker is the one that's resentful. The thinker is the one that's fearful, and the doer is the one that's more pro-social and has more of those positive spiritual values. So a modern spiritual human, whether it's theistic or non-theistic, has a more complicated human self-model which incorporates both the doer and the experiencer into it. And then the next stage beyond that is like an early Enlightenment human self-model, where maybe the experiencer is now the dominant agent in the human self-model. So most of the time I'm aware that I am really just one with the world. I'm really in that non-dual state most of the time, but there's a little bit of the I, me, my still in there, and there's a little bit of the body still in there. And then the fully non-dual human would be this one here, where the human self-model has now become entirely the experiencer self-model. So this is the spiritually enlightened human, where the human self-model is the experiential self-model. And the way you get to that is by doing things like meditation. You know, Buddhism talks about insight. They talk about concentration and insight. You concentrate by controlling attention, and controlling attention is all about that experiencer. You know, the experiencer is the one that pays attention in the world. So the more that you can control attention or be aware of attention wherever attention is, you're more and more in the experiencer there. So the concentration is necessary to experience the experiencer. And then the insight is the insight that you get from Buddhism, I believe, the insight that they're achieving is the insight that we are the experiencer. We are not the thinker, we are not the doer, we are the experiencer. And that's the consciousness that we have. The consciousness that we have is the experiencer consciousness. It's not the thinker consciousness. It's not about doing things out there in the world. It's not about, thinking things out there in the world. It's not the doer about doing things out there in the world. It's experiencing the world the way it is who we really are at a fundamental consciousness level. So it's that insight that you get from doing the years of meditation in a Buddhist practice, or the insight that you get from self-inquiry. Self-inquiry is a spiritual practice that's used. And this is where you continually ask the question, who am I? And the first answer you come up with, who am I? I me, my. The concept I me, my. And then you look at that and I'm not really I me, my. And then I'm the body. Oh, and you look at that, no, I'm not really the body. What you're left with is, I am the experiencer. And when you get that insight there, that's when you can change your human self-model from being the thinker to the experiencer. And that's where you get spiritual enlightenment.